The knock at midnight. The wind howled through the open fields of Colony Moon E17. Reed sat alone in his old wooden cabin, his boots resting near the fire. The nights here were always cold. But this one was worse. Dark clouds covered the twin. Moons and sharp winds slammed against the walls. He sipped hot tea. Staring at the empty chair across from him, he had lived alone for 6 years now. Ever since the mining accident took his wife and unborn child, silence had become his closest friend, and sometimes his worst enemy. But that night, the silence broke. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the cabin door. Knock, knock, knock. Reed froze, his cup nearly slipping from his hand. No one came here, not at this hour, not in this weather. He slowly stood up, grabbing the old blaster he kept near the wall, carefully. He walked to the door and opened it just a crack. What he saw made him step back in shock. A tall figure stood in the rain, her cloak torn, her silver skin shining under the lightning. 2 small children clung to her legs, both trembling and wide-eyed. The woman's face was tired, wet, and bruised. She spoke in broken English, her voice soft and shaky. Warm your bed, human. Please. My children need a father. Reed blinked, confused. What did you say? He asked, tightening his grip on the blaster. She took a shaky step forward, raising her empty hands slowly. I no harm. Shtus. Shelter, food, warmth, I give all. Please. The children looked up at him, their big glowing eyes full of fear and hunger. They didn't look dangerous, they looked desperate. Something inside Reed cracked. Maybe it was the way the woman's voice shook. Maybe it was the way the kids looked at him like he was their only hope. Maybe it was just the long years of loneliness catching up to him. He lowered his blaster and opened the door wider. Come in, he said quietly, but only for tonight. The woman gave a slow nod and entered with the children. They left wet footprints on the wooden floor. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, warmer, alive. Reed gave them blankets, lit another fire, and handed them bread and soup. The children ate fast, barely chewing, while the woman sat silently. She watched him, her silver eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. You have name? Reed asked, sitting back down. She hesitated, then spoke. Sarah. He pointed to the children. Yura, she said, pointing to the girl. Dren. She added, nodding at the boy. Mine, she whispered after a pause, holding them close. Reed didn't ask more. He could see they were exhausted. He set up bedding near the fireplace and handed her a dry towel. You can sleep there, said, motioning to the rug. But Sarah looked at him, slowly walked toward his room, and gently placed a hand on the doorway. In my world, she said, sharing bed means trust. Safety. Reed's heart pounded, but he shook his head. Not tonight, he said firmly. Rest here. We'll talk in the morning. She nodded slowly and returned to the fireplace. Reed went to his room, but couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the woman and her children. Why had she come to his door? Why now? Who was she running from? Outside, thunder rumbled again, but it was something else that made him sit up. A soft sound. Like movement outside the window, he grabbed his blaster and crept to the glass. Nothing, just darkness and trees. Swaying in the wind, still, his gut told him something wasn't right. The next morning, he found strange tracks outside the cabin, large clawed footprints leading to the woods. He followed them only a few meters before they vanished. Sarah stood behind him, arms crossed, face unreadable. You followed? He asked. She nodded once, slowly. Yes. They find me soon. Maybe already did. Reed looked at her, and then at the children playing near the stream. This wasn't just a widow looking for kindness. This was someone running from something dangerous. Something close, and now, whatever it was, had come to his doorstep. He turned back toward the cabin and muttered, What did I just bring into my life? Asterisk, the sun rose slow and pale over the colony moon. Reed stood at the edge of the trees, eyes fixed on the clawed footprints that vanished into the mist. Behind him, Sarah watched in silence, her arms wrapped around herself. She didn't shiver. Even in the morning chill, something about her still didn't make sense. She moved like someone trained to survive, yet spoke like someone lost and broken. Reed walked back toward the cabin, his boots crunching the frost-covered grass. He didn't speak until they reached the porch. Then he turned, looked her in the eyes, and asked the question that had been burning inside him all night. Who's following you, Sarah? She lowered her gaze. My husband, she said softly, was fighter, protector of our kind. He'd die in attack. Reed stayed quiet, letting her continue. The ones who kill him, they want what he guarded, not gold, not power. Her voice dropped, almost a whisper. They want my children. Reed's jaw tightened. Why? He asked. They just kids? Sarah glanced toward the cabin where Yora and Dren were playing with sticks and leaves. But there was something strange in the air. Even the birds weren't singing. My children. Not normal, she said slowly. They carry the old blood. Reed frowned. What does that mean? She looked at him with her glowing silver eyes. It means, she said, my children can do things others cannot. And those who know this, they will hunt until they catch us. She paused, then added, we run many nights. You are first who let us in. Reed took a deep breath. He had expected a quiet life, far from war and politics, but now, there was a woman with secrets in his bedroll and 2 alien children on his land. Still, something about Sarah made him believe her. Her voice didn't beg, it warned. She wasn't hiding because she was weak. She was hiding because she was protecting something powerful. Later that day, Reed went to the shed and pulled out an old surveillance drone. He hadn't used it since the last wild animal incident. But this wasn't about animals anymore. He programmed it to scan the outer tree lines, searching for heat signatures or movement. Something in his gut told him they didn't have much time. Inside the cabin, Sarah was teaching the children to speak more Earth words. Reed noticed how quickly they learned. Dren repeated everything only once and remembered it. Yora had already started drawing symbols in the dirt that Reed didn't recognize. These weren't normal kids, not even by alien standards. That night, after dinner, Sarah sat by the fire, brushing Yora's hair gently. Reed leaned against the wall, watching her quietly. Why did you say that last night? He asked. About warming my bed? Sarah looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. In my world, she said, when women lose bondmate, she'll choose again. To protect children, she must find strong one who stays. Reed nodded slowly, unsure what to say. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable, she added softly, but I see in you same pain I carry. He turned his head, looking away from the fire. You lost someone too, she said gently. I see it in your eyes. He nodded once. My wife. 6 years ago, Sarah stood, walked over to him, and placed a hand on his shoulder. Pain changes us, she whispered, but it also connects us. Reed didn't answer, but for a moment. He didn't pull away either. Then, outside, the drone beeped. Reed rushed to the monitor. Sarah close behind. The screen showed a faint figure at the far edge of the property. Tall, armored, moving slow but steady. The scanner picked up 2 more heat signatures behind it, smaller, but just as fast. They found us, Sarah said coldly, her eyes glowing brighter now. Too soon. Reed loaded his blaster, the same one from the war. He looked at Sarah. Are you ready to fight? She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled a sharp blade from beneath her cloak, one carved with symbols that shimmered like stars. I was born to protect, she said. Even if I die doing it. Reed stepped closer to her, meeting her gaze. You're not dying on my land, he said firmly. Not while I still have a trigger finger. Sierra smiled, just barely. It was the first time she had. But even as they made their plans, even as they checked doors and windows, Reed couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she still hadn't told him, something about her past, or the true power her children carried, because whatever was coming wasn't just here to steal, it was coming to claim something sacred, and Reed had just stepped between it and its prize. Reed had never been good with kids. He liked quiet, routine, and being alone. But since Sarah and her children came into his life, everything had changed. He now woke up to laughter, strange humming noises, and little feet running through the house, and sometimes things he couldn't explain. One morning, Reed found Dren outside near the barn. The boy stood with his hands lifted toward a floating stone. It hovered inches above his palms. Glowing faintly with a blue light, Reed stared. In silence, not sure if it was a trick of the sunlight or something else. But the moment Dren saw him, the stone dropped, and the boy smiled innocently. Good morning, Papa. That word still hit Reed like a hammer. He didn't correct him. He couldn't bring himself to. Later that day, Reed sat with Sarah on the porch, watching the children chase each other. He finally asked, what exactly can they do? Sarah was quiet for a long time before she answered, Dren can move small things. Without touching, Yura can sense life. Even hidden ones. Reed raised an eyebrow. You mean? She can feel if something's watching her. Syra nodded. Even through walls, even when they far away, Reed looked toward the woods, where the drone had last detected movement. Useful talent, he muttered. Sarah's voice turned soft. Useful, but dangerous. Many want to use them. Control them. That evening, Yura walked into Reed's room while he cleaned his old gear. She stood in silence, her eyes glowing gently in the dark. What's wrong, Yura? He asked, wiping his hands. There is something under the ground. She said quietly, it watches us. Reed frowned. Under the ground. Like a tunnel. She shook her head. No tunnel. It's alive. But hiding, Reed didn't know what to make of that. But he trusted his gut, and his gut was screaming that something was off. He grabbed his boots, blaster, and motion tracker and stepped outside. It was already dark. But the moonlight was strong enough to see shadows moving between trees. He scanned the soil near the barn, near the stream, near the crops. Nothing. Then the motion tracker beeped something beneath, 2 meters down, shifting. Reed stepped back, confused, before he could dig. The ground gave a soft thump, like something retreating, then silence, back inside. He found Sarah preparing the children for sleep. He told her what Yura had said, and what he saw. Sarah grew pale. Her hands freezing mid-movement. They sent a crawler, she whispered. Scouts. That burrow. Silent hunters. Reed looked out the window, his hand gripping the blaster tighter. So what now? We stay inside, she said. We protect the children. If it surfaces, I will deal with it. But Reed couldn't sleep. Not with something slithering under his land. Not with 2 alien kids calling him Papa. And a widow with too many secrets lying near his fire. The next morning, strange marks were found in the garden, spirals burned into the soil. None of the crops were touched, but the spirals pulsed with heat when Reed held his hand above. Them, Dren and Yura, didn't seem scared. They just watched, quiet and alert. Then Dren stepped forward and placed his small hand into the center of one spiral. The mark glowed brightly and vanished, like smoke blown into the wind. Reed blinked. How did you do that? Dren shrugged. It listens when I ask nicely. Reed turned to Sarah. Okay, now I really need to know, what are they? She looked at her children. Then at Reed. They are born of 2 bloodlines, she said slowly. My mate was not just a soldier. He was descendant of an ancient force, pure energy. Reed's breath caught. You mean? Your children are part weapon. Syra shook her head. Not weapon. They are keys. To open or close what others fear. Reed stared at Dren and Yora, who were now laughing and chasing each other like normal kids. But he knew better. Nothing about this was normal. These kids were targets, symbols, maybe even tools for war, and now? They were his responsibility. The drone signaled again. Movement? This time, near the northern ridge, Reed raced outside, looking through the scope. He saw a tall figure in black armor vanish behind a rock. It wasn't alone, two smaller. Forms moved with it, carrying scanners. They were searching. Sarah stood beside him, silent and strong. They're getting closer, Reed said. She nodded. We must prepare. Tomorrow, we leave. But tonight, we protect. Reed felt something warm brush his hand. Juru, holding his fingers tight. Don't be scared, Papa, she whispered. I'll help you. That night, Reed reinforced every window, every door. He placed traps. Along the fields, weapons near every entrance, and still, as the cold crept in, the fire burned low, and the wind picked up. Reed knew in his heart the real storm hadn't come yet. The cabin creaked under the weight of the cold night. Wind whispered through the cracks, brushing against the wooden walls like ghostly fingers. Reed sat in his chair, eyes half closed. But his blaster lay on his lap, ready. He hadn't slept properly in days. Not since Sarah and the children came, and now that he knew what they were. He didn't dare let his guard down. Sarah moved quietly around the room. Tucking the children into their bedding, she moved with such grace, such calm. Like she had done this 1,000 times before. Even in the middle of war, even with death. Nearby, Reed watched her. Her silver skin glowing softly in the firelight. Her eyes thoughtful, her body tired but steady. She turned toward him once the children were asleep. You should rest, she said softly. You need strength for what? Combs. Reed shook his head. Can't sleep. Not with them out there. She stepped closer, hesitating, then sat beside him. Not too close, not too far. The bed, she said gently, is cold but big. I can make it warm if you want. Reed glanced at her, unsure if she was teasing. Or serious. Sarah looked straight at him. No smile, no games, just honesty. In my culture, she continued, when danger comes, we bond with those we trust. To sleep together is not just for comfort. It is promise. A silent shield. Reed looked away, his throat dry. It's not that simple. He muttered. It can be, she replied. If you let it. He stood up, restless, walking to the window. Outside, shadows shifted between trees. Maybe animals, maybe scouts. Or maybe the fear inside him playing tricks. Syra, he said, without turning, you barely know me. Why do you keep offering yourself like this? There was silence behind him. Then her voice, low, raw, real. Because I see how you look at my children, she said. Not with fear. Not like they are weapons, but like they are yours. You protect them. Not because I ask, but because your heart tells you to. Reed turned slowly. Her words wrapping around something buried deep inside him. Memories of a nursery. Never finished. A crib, still boxed in the attic. A future stolen by an accident that left him with nothing but echoes. And now, 2 alien children called him Papa without being told to. And a woman, no, a mother stood, offering him something no one had offered in years. Not just warmth, but meaning. He stepped forward, his voice soft. I'm scared. Cyrus smiled gently. So am I. They didn't touch, not yet, but something shifted between them, an understanding. Quiet but strong. He walked to his bedroom, and for the first time in years, left the door open. Sarah looked at the children once more. whispered a word. In her language and followed. They didn't speak as they lay on opposite sides of the bed. The air between them was still, but slowly, gently, her hand found his, and he didn't pull away. Her touch wasn't bold or demanding. It was steady. Like an anchor, that night, Reed didn't dream of fire or screams. He dreamed of laughter in the fields, of a girl chasing butterflies and a boy building towers from stones. Kah! And Sarah, laughing alive, her eyes full of light. But peace never stays long before dawn. The drone outside triggered an alert, a soft beep that flashed red on the wall. Reed woke instantly, grabbing his blaster. Sarah sat up too, calm, alert. Her hand already on the blade under the bed, outside. Footsteps moved fast through the snow-covered grass. Multiple heat signatures, 5, maybe 6. Approaching the cabin from 3 sides, Reed peeked through the window. Spotting tall figures in black armor moving like shadows, they were silent, but methodical. They knew what they were looking for. "Take the kids," Reed said quickly. "Hide them in the basement tunnel." Sarah nodded, already moving, her body low, swift, efficient. Reed stepped out on the porch. Heart pounding, finger near the trigger. He wasn't just defending strangers. Now this was his home, his family, his choice, and he would not let anyone take that away. The sky turned orange as the first rays of dawn touched the frozen earth. But there was no warmth in the air, only tension thick enough to choke. Reed crouched behind a stacked pile of crates, blaster aimed at the tree line, every sound made. His finger twitch, a rustle, a crunch, a low mechanical hum in the distance. They were close now. He could feel it in his bones. Behind him, the cabin stood still. Quiet, like a beast holding its breath, down below. Sarah hid with the children in the basement tunnel, a narrow space beneath the floor where root vegetables used to be stored. Now it was the last safe spot left on the property. Reed had locked the trapdoor behind them, covering it with crates and sacks. But he knew if the hunters came inside, they would smell fear. They would hear every breath. Then he saw movement. A tall figure emerged between the trees. Armor black as coal, visor reflecting the light. 2 more came behind it, smaller, faster. Their bodies wrapped in cloaks with scanning rods in hand. They walked like predators. No rush, no panic, just cruel purpose. Reed's heart pounded. But he stayed low, waiting, watching. The lead hunter stopped at the fence, then knelt and touched the soil. He spoke in a sharp alien tongue, voice cold and clipped. The others spread out, one toward the barn, the other circling wide. Reed recognized their formation. It was a trapping pattern. They weren't just searching, they were hurting him. He knew he couldn't take them all in a straight fight, but this was his land, his rules, his traps. He tapped his wrist device and activated the first defense, the motion mines buried near the water tanks. A soft beep echoed, then boom. A shockwave burst through the trees, sending birds scattering. The hunter at the barn was thrown back. Armor cracked, groaning. The others spun around, startled, weapons raised. Reed fired from his position. Striking one in the leg, sparks flew, and the hunter dropped behind a log. Returning fire, energy blasts ripped through the crates around Reed, one missing his head by inches. He rolled, crawled, ducked into the chicken shed, and fired again. This time hitting another in the shoulder. The lead hunter shouted something into a wrist cum, then pulled out a strange device, a sphere with glowing veins. He threw it toward the cabin, and it stuck to the wall, pulsing. Reed's eyes widened. It was a breach bomb. If it went off, the walls would shatter, and the basement would be exposed. He sprinted from the shed, grabbing a long metal pole, and swinging hard, he hit the device just in time, sending it flying into the snow. It exploded a moment later, bright light. Loud ring, shaking the trees, but the cabin still stood. Barely, the lead hunter turned, faceplate cracked, staring. At Reed, they locked eyes for a long moment. Then the hunter spoke, in surprisingly clear English. "You are not her kind. Why do you protect them?" Reed spat on the ground. "Because I know what monsters look like." The hunter lifted his weapon. But before he could fire, a roar echoed from inside the cabin. The trapdoor burst open, and Sarah flew out, blade in hand, her eyes glowing like molten silver. She struck like lightning, fast and fierce, slicing through one of the smaller hunters before he could react. Dren and Yora stood at the doorway behind her, hands glowing, eyes locked on the enemy. The lead hunter shouted in panic, "Take the children alive!" But it was too late. Yora raised both hands, and the earth beneath the hunter cracked and rose like fingers of stone. He stumbled, then fell to one knee. Dren moved next, lifting a chunk of frozen ground and hurling it like a cannonball into the final attacker's chest. The fight turned fast from ambush to retreat. One of the hunters activated a beacon, and a ship roared above the trees, preparing to extract them. Reed fired one last shot into the air, not at the ship, but at the tree holding up its landing sensor. The tree cracked, collapsed, and the ship veered off course. Crashing sideways into the ridge, flames lit the forest edge as the last of the hunters limped into the firelight. Vanishing, silence returned, broken only by the crackling of burning leaves. Reed dropped to one knee, breathing heavy, shoulders shaking. Sarah moved to him, placing her hand on his chest. "You fought like one of us," she said softly. He looked at her, voice weak but steady. "I fought for what's mine," behind them. Yura and Dren stood side by side, their powers dimming, not scared, not crying, calm for the first time. They looked not like lost children, but like heirs of something ancient. An unstoppable asterisk. The forest burned low through the night, smoke rising like ghosts into the early sky. Reed sat on the porch, his body aching from the fight, his hands still covered in dirt and ash. He watched Sarah, who stood motionless at the edge of the trees, her blade buried in the ground. She hadn't spoken since the battle. Not a word, just stood there, breathing slow, eyes lost in the flames. Like a soldier watching old memories die, Reed wanted to ask her 100 questions, but none of them came out, because deep down, he already knew she wasn't just a mother on the run. She wasn't just a widow hiding in the dark. She was something else, something older, something terrifyingly powerful. When she finally turned to him, her eyes glowed with something far beyond fear. She walked toward him slowly, each step sure. Her voice quiet but sharp. "There is something I must tell you," she said, before more. "Come." Reed stood, stiff and sore. "I'm listening." Sarah looked at the cabin, at the children peeking out from behind the curtain. "My people," she began, "are not just refugees. We are keepers of something sacred. My bondmate, my late husband, was heir to a dying bloodline." Reed frowned. "Royalty." She nodded once, but not just royal, she said, divine. She moved her hand slowly through the air, and a glowing pattern formed above her palm, a swirling symbol Reed had never seen before. "The old ones left behind power," she said, "buried in our genes, in our minds, hidden from those who only seek to control." Dren and Yura were born with that light. Reed felt his breath catch. "So, your kids are like living keys." "Yes," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Keys to something locked." "For centuries, a vault, a weapon?" Reed asked, still trying to grasp it all. Sarah shook her head. A choice for the galaxy to rise or fall." Reed looked down, trying to steady his thoughts. He had seen war, loss, hunger, but nothing like this. "I'm just a farmer, Sarah," he muttered. "I grow food, fix fences. I don't belong in all this." She stepped closer, placing her hand on his chest, right over his heart. "You do," she said gently. "Because you did not run. You stood between death and my children. Without knowing the truth, you chose them, not for power, but for love." Reed looked at her hand, warm and steady. Something old and broken inside him began to mend. He took a deep breath, then asked the question that had been rising in his chest for days. "Why me, Syra? Out of every place, every person, why knock on my door?" Sarah's gaze softened, and for the first time, her voice trembled. "Because I dreamed of you, in the deep sleep chamber, when we escaped the last city. I saw your face. You stood between fire and storm, holding my children's hands." Reed's jaw tightened. A vision. She nodded, or a warning. The children stepped outside, walking hand in hand toward them. Yura looked up. "They're coming again." More ships, bigger ones, added Dren, eyes glowing faintly. Sira turned toward the sky, her blade returning to her hand as if summoned by thought. Reed clenched his fists. "We can't fight an army," Sira agreed. "But we don't have to." She turned back to Reed, her voice stronger now, like a queen ready for war. "You must take them to the ancient ground." Reed raised an eyebrow. "What ground?" Sira looked toward the northern cliffs. "Beyond the river, there's a chamber buried under the ridge. Protected by old codes, only the bloodline can open it. My children. And you, me?" Reed said, confused. She placed both hands on his shoulders. "You bonded to them?" "Through choice, not blood. The chamber will feel that." Reed looked toward the burning sky, smoke rising where enemy ships would soon arrive. "I'm no hero, Sarah," he whispered. She smiled. "You're more than that. You're a father." The words hit him harder than any explosion. Father, not by blood, but by heart, by action, by love. He looked at Dren and Yura, both waiting for his signal. And in that moment, he realized he'd die for them, kill for them, run with them to the edge of the stars. As the morning wind shifted, carrying the rumble of incoming ships, Reed made his decision. He picked up his bag, slung his blaster over his shoulder, and reached out his hands. "Let's go," he said, "before the sky falls." Syra watched them run toward the cliffs, her heart torn between pride and pain. She stayed behind, blade in hand, facing the growing thunder in the sky, because sometimes a mother doesn't run. She stands, she fights, she burns bright enough to blind the dark. The cliffs of the northern ridge rose like jagged teeth. Reed moved fast, heart pounding, Dren on his back, and Yura holding tight to his hand. They ran through thorny brush, across frozen streams, into the ancient paths Sarah had spoken of. Behind them, the sky roared as enemy ships broke through the clouds. Black and red vessels, their lights flashing like distant lightning. War was coming, and time was almost gone. Reed didn't stop, not even when his legs screamed or when his lungs burned. He pushed forward. Because he had made a promise, not with words, but with action. He would protect these children like they were his own, because in every way that mattered. They were at the top of the ridge. Dren raised his hand, pointing to a spot hidden behind roots and vines. "There," he said, "I feel it." Reed dropped to his knees, brushing away leaves and moss, revealing a circle of smooth black stone. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. Symbols appeared, glowing softly as the children stepped closer. Yura reached out and placed her palm on the stone. Dren followed, his hand beside hers. The symbols turned golden, spinning, shifting. Then a sound echoed, not loud, but deep, like a breath being held for centuries was finally released. The ground shook slightly, and a doorway opened beneath the rock, stairs leading into warm light below. Reed turned and looked back toward the cabin far in the distance. Smoke curled in the sky, a burning trail where ships had landed. He didn't see Sarah, but he felt her like her spirit stood beside him, pushing him forward. "Come on," he whispered to the kids. "Let's finish what your mother started." They entered the chamber below, walls carved with ancient markings, glowing like stars. In the center stood a tall platform, surrounded by floating orbs of light. As the children stepped inside, the orbs spun faster, and the room began to hum. A voice echoed from nowhere and everywhere, speaking in a language Reed didn't understand, but somehow felt a voice of judgment and choice. The orbs surrounded the children, scanning them, testing them. Yura stood calm. Dren's hands glowed bright. Then the lights turned blue, and the voice softened. Reed stepped forward, unsure if he belonged. But when he reached out, one of the orbs came to him. It hovered over his chest, then pulsed softly, as if saying, "Yes, you too." Then the voice spoke again, this time in English. "The bond is true. The guardian is chosen." The bloodline continues. Light burst from the floor, forming a protective dome around the children and Reed. It spread through the ground like roots of light, reaching far beyond the ridge above. The incoming enemy ships paused, then began to shake. Panels broke, engines failed, as if some silent force had awakened. The sky shimmered, and a wave of pure energy pulsed outward. Not a weapon, but a signal, a warning to every ship, every hunter, every empire watching. They are protected. Now this land is claimed. This family is no longer alone. Back at the cabin, Syra stood in the center of fire and ruin, her blade broken, her body bruised. But her eyes blazed like stars. She had held them off long enough. She had given her children time. And now? She smiled because the light touched her too, warm and full, like a promise fulfilled. Then she dropped to her knees, her last breath carried in the wind. Days passed, then weeks. Reed and the children returned to what was left of the cabin. He rebuilt what he could, with Yura helping gather stone and Dren shaping wood without touching it. They planted new seeds, mended fences, and laid stones in the garden where Sarah once stood. Every evening, they sat by the fire, her name spoken, like a prayer not of sorrow, but of pride. And slowly, the world began to change. Other refugees came, drawn by the signal. They brought news of empires falling silent, of raiders disappearing. Something ancient had awakened. And peace, fragile but real, had begun to grow again. Reed stood on his porch, a child on each side. He looked out at the stars and smiled softly. He had once been just a lonely farmer, a broken man with no one to hold. Now, he was father to 2 children born of stars, guardian of a bloodline older than any crown. And though the war had taken many things from him, it had given him something greater, a new kind of family, one he never expected, but one he'd protect with everything he had forever.